So in step 3, we're computing the cost per equivalent unit. So we have our beginning inventory. We basically add those together. The $15,000 is our direct materials cost for beginning inventory. The $10,000 is our conversion cost. So together those are $25,000. The current costs, these are the costs to complete what was left from the prior period, and then to complete more units this period, and to work partway on what's left in work in process. So that's $75,000 for direct materials, $45,000 for conversion costs. These would be given to you in the problem. So we need to add up the direct materials and conversion costs. Now, a lot of times what you'll see is in the chapter they use the weighted average method, which is what I'm using here in this example. Previously, another way to do it is to exclude the beginning inventory. We know what that cost was, so and then to make 3 different buckets: beginning inventory, costs that were totally completed and started during the period, and then costs remaining in work in process. That's another way you might see it, but for now, just go ahead and just do it the way that the book does, and that'll probably be the way that the homework does it as well. So direct materials, that total is $90,000. That is the amount that includes $15,000 from the previous period related to what was in work in process, and then $75,000 more for this period. Same thing for conversion costs of $55,000. So what do we do with those numbers? Now we need to figure out what the cost per equivalent unit is. We're just combining, we're using the numerator from step 3 with the denominator from step 2. So we got the 90,000 divided by 120,000 for our direct materials. Our total cost for direct materials is 90,000. The total equivalent units that we figured out was 120,000. So what's the cost per equivalent unit there? It's 75 cents. What's the equivalent unit cost for conversion cost? The 55,000 from step 3 divided by the 110,000 from step 2. That's 50 cents for conversion cost equivalent unit. Now remember, why is there a difference between the 120 and the 110? Is because that 20,000 units was completely finished for raw materials purposes, but it was not completely finished. It was only halfway done for conversion costs. So that denominator is lower under conversion costs. So now we got that 75 cents for direct materials, the 50 cents for conversion costs. Now in the book, some of the examples, you'll actually break out that conversion cost into a direct labor and an overhead piece. So you might have 2 different calculations there rather than the one. It'll be the same process, same format there. But so remember the 75 cents as we go to the final page. Remember the 75 cents for direct materials and the 50 cents for conversion costs as we go to step 4 for assigning and reconciling costs. And what we're doing here is we're taking the cost per equivalent unit that we figured out in step 3, and we are applying it to the equivalent units that we determined in step 2. So you'll see that we're breaking out the cost of units completed during the period. That's the first section there under step 4. The second section is goods in work in process inventory. And we're basically saying, what is the cost that we completed and is shipped off to the next department or to finished goods, and what are the costs that are still in work in process that we're going to be working with in the next coming period to finish those up. So we take the 100,000, remember these are totally completed and transferred out units, 100,000 we determined in step 2 for both the direct materials and conversion costs. Multiply that by what we had for the cost per equivalent unit in step 3. So for direct materials, it's 100,000 times 75 cents. That's 75,000. For conversion costs, it's 100,000 times 50 cents. For 50,000, that adds up to 125. That's the cost that's going to be transferred out of this department, either as beginning inventory for the next department, or if we're the final stage in the process, that'll go into finished goods. Now let's figure out what goes into work in process inventory. We use that same schedule, step 2. I know this is confusing, so you might have to think through this a couple times and discuss it in discussion form. But what are the equivalent units that are on hand in work in process? So we have those 20,000 units, but related to conversion costs, they're only halfway done. Remember, that's 10,000 units, equivalent units. So for direct materials, we use the full 20 because they're 100% done. For conversion costs, we only use half of that for 10. So we got the 20 times 75 cents for 15,000, the 10,000 equivalent units times 50 cents for 5,000. That gives us a total of 20,000. So what do we get when we add those together? Well, I've highlighted it there in bold. 125 plus 20 is 145. That also ties back to step 3. You got to make sure that you tie this back, because that's the check to make sure that you did this properly. The total costs are 145. That's the cost from what we had in beginning inventory with all the new costs that we added during the current period. We have to make sure that we split that 145 out properly to what is shipped to the next department and what we have currently in work in process. And so you'll see that we do 145 ties back to that before. If not, then you made an error somewhere and you got to figure out what actually is going on. So final question here, and make sure we understand what's going on. What is a work in process inventory? Well, that is a 20,000. We're going to be carrying that forward to the next period in our own department. That 125 is shipped out to whatever the next production process is, or if we're the final production process, that would be shipped out to finished goods. Okay, so that's a lot to actually look at. It's going to require some practice and discussion, I'm sure, in the discussion forum, so I'll help you out with that. But make sure you work through this a couple times and see kind of what we're doing. Read the chapter, look at the PowerPoint slide if you need to, and also the supplementary materials if you have some questions on that. Process costing is pretty difficult to get the hang of, like when you first see it the first time. So continue to practice and look at the homework, ask me questions as you need, and we'll make sure you get squared away on that. Okay, the last thing I wanted to do was give you a devotional recommendation for the week outside of your accounting coursework. This is obviously optional, but wanted to recommend to you John Wesley's Social Ethics, Praxis, and Principles. This is a book I picked up about a year ago, and what it does is this is a book that looks at what John Wesley said on some of the key social issues of the 18th century. Now, remember Wesley was born in the early 1700s, lived to almost the end of the 1700s, and some of the key issues at that time were the poor, the education, slavery, prisoners and prison reform. It might not be the key issues today, like homosexuality and abortion and those type of things that you see on the nightly news all the time. But in this book, basically it says, what are the principles that Wesley drew upon through Scripture in his theology to define his stance and what Wesleyans have believed since that time on these key social justice issues. And even though I don't really talk about the current issues of today, you can kind of use that framework for framing what Wesley would say in terms of the current social issues that are presently before us, and how some of those jive with Scripture, some of them don't, how we might come down on a certain position on these prevalent social issues. Even outside of the current application of this is really good to understand as kind of a piece of history of how Wesley and William Wilberforce, we talked a little bit about him in Accounting 201, that book Amazing Grace and the movie by the same name, how they both argued and fought against slavery for the abolition movement, both in UK and in the United States, and how their work and theology was really prevalent in that. So as a piece of history in the Christian church and in society in general, this would be a really good book to read and understand how Wesleyans have come down on some of these key social issues, and not only just how, but why we've made those certain positions. So once again, John Wesley's Social Issues, Praxis, and Principles. If you never had a chance to read any of Wesley's sermons, I really recommend you to do so. There's a lot of books out there that have different adaptations with notes and things on Wesley's sermons, but you can just get on Google and type in Wesley's standard sermons and just read a couple of those. A Plain Account of Christian Perfection is one that's really often cited, and it's really a great sermon to just have a chance to read. They're not that long, just maybe 7 to 10 pages. It would take you 20 or 30 minutes, but highly recommend any of his sermons to you as well. So anyway, Wesley's a great person to read and draw upon, and there's a reason that schools are named Indian Wesleyan, and Wesleyan churches have risen up and done real well. So it's all stemming from John Wesley and his work as the founder of Methodism and the Wesleyan Church. So anyway, I hope you have a chance to check that out or some of Wesley's sermons, and if you do, give me a shot and we'll talk about it. We'll see you for Workshop 3. Thanks.